In the middle of the night in Elder Ridge, Montana, two 6-year-old twin girls are pushed out into the snow, their pink dresses torn, their faces streaked with dirt and tears. They clutch a broken teddy bear, shaking as the house they once called home slams shut behind them. No neighbors dare enter. No family comes to claim them. Their story should be over. But then a roar rings out across the snowy silence. A loyal German shepherd named Valor and Silas Rowan, a battle-hardened soldier. What begins as a rescue of two freezing children unravels a plot of stolen heritage and betrayal buried deep within this quiet town. And deep inside, a soldier, a dog, and two girls are fighting for a place to belong. The wind came down off the mountains like a long, low whistle, combing the dark pine tops and driving the snow sideways across Elder Ridge. On Cedar Bluff Road, a single porch light burned a tired yellow over a wooden stoop where two small shapes hunched together, 6-year-old twins in torn pink dresses with hems stiffened by ice. Their faces were streaked with mud and tears, their hair a tangle of pale knots that caught flakes and held them like cold beads. They had a single suitcase between them, its brass latch sprung, and a broken teddy bear with one eye and a chewed ear. Button, they called it, when they were allowed to call anything by a loving name. Maisie was the narrower of the two, chin a little pointed, eyes bright even when raw with crying. She had a habit of counting breath in storms to calm herself. Mabel was rounder in the cheeks and gentler in the gaze, the one who sang to shadows under her breath on nights she couldn't sleep. Now neither sang. Inside the doorway, a man and a woman argued in low, serrated voices, and the twins shivered like two leaves pressed to a railing. Caleb Drayton, their father by blood and oath once spoken at a bedside, had shoulders like a former high school linebacker gone to seed, a face grown ruddy from winter and whiskey, and hands too accustomed to slamming doors when words failed him. There had been good years. He used to lift both girls at once and walk them like a human carousel around the living room. But those days began to die the week the lumber mill cut shifts and the medical bills for Ruth, the twins' mother, came due. Grief had found all the loose places in him and filled them with anger. Beside him stood Opal Drayton, stepmother by a remarriage that arrived fast and perfumed. She was all bright hair curled to the shoulder and lipstick that didn't smudge even in the cold. She'd come to Elder Ridge from a flatter place with big plans, the sort that liked the sound of her own heels on wooden floors. She could be charming in public, all bakery gift cards and compliments to the mayor's wife. In private, she kept a ledger in her head, debts, advantages, which doors opened when you talked about property and which when you talked about pity. Tonight, pity had no place at her table. "They can't stay," Opal said, low and hard, as if the words themselves might be evidence. "You heard what the hospital signed. You want to lose the roof, too." Caleb's jaw worked, sagging into a sorrow that curdled into stubbornness. He stepped past the threshold and, with a clumsy sweep of his hand, sent the twin suitcase skittering into the snow. Shirts burst loose like frightened birds. "Go on," he growled without meeting their eyes, then shut the door with a finality that rattled the glass. Across the road, behind a curtained window, a woman watched and flinched as the latch fell. Jean Whitaker had a crown of silver hair coiled low and a cardigan that smelled faintly of cedar soap. She'd cataloged books in the school library for 35 years and could recommend a story for any sorrow if her courage held. 10 winters back, when her younger sister needed her, John hesitated for one evening too many. The knock came too late and the loss lodged. Since then, decisions felt like thin ice. Her hands hovered now over a phone no one else would answer. "Lord, forgive me," she whispered, "but I don't know if I make it better or worse." She let the curtain fall, then lifted it again, as if grace might slip between the inches of fabric if invited twice. On the east side of town, a man and a dog moved through the weather like two parts of a single resolve. Silas Rowan was 38, the distance in his eyes measuring more than miles, the easy strength in his gait giving him away as soldier, even in denim and a canvas field coat. Combat had given him a thin white line along his left forearm and a habit of listening to silences more than speeches. The quiet had taught him to be the person who steps forward when everyone else steps back. He had come home to Elder Ridge to help an aging uncle rehab, a bent barn, and to learn what peace might sound like where church bells and chainsaws took turns at the morning air. Padding at his knee was Valor, a black and tan German shepherd with a broad chest, an old scar feathered into the fur along his flank, and a gaze that didn't wander when it found a person in distress. Once, on a training day nobody talks about without lowering their voices, Valor took a blade meant for a human and never broke eye contact with the man he was protecting. Since then, his name fit him like a well-made harness. He checked wind, checked ground, checked the heartbeat of a street before Silas even saw its corners. They were cutting across Cedar Bluff to avoid a drift that had swallowed the sidewalk when Valor stopped short. Nose lifted, body tightening like a drawn bow. Silas, who had learned to trust that posture the way a sailor trusts the ocean's shift, touched two fingers to the dog's shoulder. "What do you have, buddy?" Valor angled into the wind, then toward the broken comb of light on a porch 2 doors down. The first thing Silas saw in the spill of yellow was the suitcase burst open to the snow. The second was the buttonless eye of a teddy bear, catching light like a tiny blind star. Then the girls came into focus. Two little faces half sunk in their collars, legs tucked under to hoard heat, shoulders pressed so close they looked sewn together. "Hey," Silas said, soft as he could make it, dropping to a knee so the world didn't loom so tall. "I'm Silas." Dorky, he shrugged out of his coat before they could decide whether to fear him, draped it over both small bodies at once, and watched them lean into each other under its weight like two birds under the same leaf. "This is Valor," he added. "He's the brave one." Valor approached the way professionals approach, head lowered, ears attentive but not sharp, tail still instead of thumping. Maisie reached out first with a hand so cold her fingers moved like stiff hinges, and Valor lowered his big head into her palm, allowing the contact as if it were a contract. Mabel pressed button against his nose, and Valor inhaled deeply, committing the smell of cloth and child and home not safe to whatever place dogs make maps from. "Did you fall?" Silas asked gently, eyes skimming their scraped knees, the tremor along Mabel's mouth. Maisie shook her head and tried to answer. The words came out in little fogs. "We can't go back." The porch creaked. The curtains shifted. Gene Whitaker's shape hovered, then retreated, then hovered again, a small battle turning in a small room across the way. From behind the twins' closed door came the muffled clink of a glass, set harder than necessary on a table, and a woman's laugh that didn't reach a human temperature. Silas looked at that door and felt the old line of heat crawl his spine, the one that shows up right before decisions. "Okay," he said, keeping his eyes level with theirs. "Here's what we're going to do. We're going to stand up slow so the world doesn't spin. We're going to gather what's ours, and we're going to get warm. I've got a thermos in the truck and a blanket that won't quit." He didn't ask permission from a house that had withdrawn it. He offered his hands like a dock and felt two small grips decide to trust. Valor fell in on the outside, an escort with fur and gravity. Together they gathered shirts from the snow, a single sock, a book with a bent corner. The teddy bear went into Valor's observation, which is to say he watched it like a sentry watches a gate. They made it to the curb as a gust tried to push them back, and Silas took the wind on his shoulders, the way he had once taken a door for a team. At the truckin' old F-150 with a heater that needed coaxing, he opened the back, spread a wool blanket, and settled the girls, tucking the coat around their legs. He poured cocoa from the thermos, added a swirl of steam to the winter, and watched Mabel's hands tremble around the cup until the tremble slowed. "What are your names?" he asked when color returned to lips. "I'm Maisie," said the narrower, finally meeting his gaze. "This is Mabel." "Good," he said softly, as if their names were passwords to a safer place. "You're going to be okay tonight, Maisie and Mabel." He glanced at the house again, at the light that refused to change, at the curtain that refused to open. He could have driven away and called it in from the highway. He could have waited for morning and let the official words arrive in official order. But he'd spent years learning which moments were tests you couldn't retake. He turned his face toward Jean's window and held it there for an extra beat. Not to shame her, but to offer a bridge. She stepped into the frame as if the invitation reached her through the glass and pressed a hand to her chest. The hand dropped, the curtain fell, A new light clicked on, deeper in the house. In the passenger seat, Valor lifted the teddy bear with careful teeth and placed it in the twins' laps. He breathed the scent again, then looked at Silas with that language dogs use when they're writing oaths in the air. I know this smell now, and I will keep it. We're going to the sheriff's office, Silas told the girls. There's a woman there who knows how to fix broken nights. He meant Marjorie Hale, though her name belonged to the next chapter. For this one, it was enough to say there was a door somewhere that would open, and that he knew the sound of it. Snow tapped the windshield like small fingers asking to be let in. The truck's engine coughed and then found its rhythm. Maisie leaned her cheek to Valor's shoulder. Mabel tucked Button under her chin. Silas checked the mirrors once house, road, house, and eased them out into the empty street, the taillights painting 2 red commas across the white until the turn took even those away. The sheriff's office in Elder Ridge was a brick building that seemed too small to hold the troubles that sometimes pressed against its doors. The walls smelled faintly of brewed coffee and old paper, the air heavy with the hush of late hours. Silas Rowan led the 2 girls inside, their pink dresses still stiff with ice. The mud dried along the hems like stubborn shadows. They clutched his coat around their shoulders, cheeks still pale from the wind, and behind them padded Valor, his amber eyes alert, his breath forming soft clouds in the warmer air. Sheriff Nora Beck was waiting at the front desk, her frame sturdy in a flannel shirt tucked into dark jeans, her badge gleaming on a leather belt. At 43, she carried herself with the kind of calm strength that could settle an argument with a single look. Her dark hair was streaked with early gray, pulled into a neat bun, and her steady gaze revealed the discipline of a woman who had grown up one of 6 siblings on a cattle ranch. Responsibility had been bred into her bones. A horse had crushed her left leg when she was 17, and though she walked with only the faintest stiffness now, the memory of pain had given her patience for others in quiet suffering. She crouched to the girl's level, her voice gentler than Silas expected. You're safe here, Mabel. We'll make sure no one shuts the door on you again tonight. She called for Marjorie Hale, who arrived moments later, arms full of files and a bag that clinked softly with colored pencils. Marjorie was in her early 50s, tall and slender, with auburn hair streaked silver at the temples. She wore a dark green blazer, practical boots, and a long wool scarf that smelled faintly of lavender. Her hazel eyes carried warmth balanced with steel, the kind of gaze that had steadied countless frightened children. Marjorie had grown up in foster care herself, passed between strangers' homes, and carried with her a vow that no child should sit unseen in the dark. She had once drawn her way through grief-sketching faces of people she lost, then those she imagined could keep her safe. Now she carried boxes of crayons and pencils into every interview, believing pictures sometimes opened doors words could not. She guided the twins into a small room with a heater buzzing faintly against the chill. The room was plain, a metal table, 2 chairs, and a single one-way mirror that reflected their fragile shapes. Maisie clung to the teddy bear, Button, pressing her cheek against its worn fur, while Mabel traced circles on the table with one finger, lips pressed tight. Marjorie sat opposite them, resting her hands in the open, and spoke softly. You don't have to tell me everything right away. Just what you feel ready to share. Sometimes drawing helps too. She slid the pencils across the table, their colors a small rainbow on a night that had none. At first, silence filled the room, broken only by Valor's low breathing as he stretched out by their feet. Then Maisie whispered, Mama was sick. In the hospital. She didn't want to sign the papers, but they made her. Her voice cracked, but Marjorie only nodded slowly, letting the pause belong to the child. Mabel added in a tremor, She cried. She said it was wrong. The words hung in the air like fragile glass. Marjorie noted them carefully, then looked back with eyes that promised belief. Thank you for trusting me. That was very brave. Outside the room, Silas stood with Nora, arms crossed, jaw tight as he listened. He wasn't a man quick to anger, but hearing those words awoke something old in him, the soldier's instinct that injustice was a battlefield too, and one where he could not walk away. Nora wrote the first notes of an incident report, her pen moving quick, but her face set in stone. If Ruth Drayton was coerced, that's bigger than neglect, she murmured. Silas nodded, gaze dropping to Valor through the glass. The dog's ears flicked once, as though agreeing. Later, when the girls had been given warm cocoa and led to a cot in a side room, Silas took Valor out for air. The town had gone quiet, snow still clinging to roofs and wires. Valor's nose twitched the moment they stepped past the sheriff's lot. He pulled toward Main Street, muscles taut, until they reached the side of a shuttered law office, its window painted with the fading gold letters, Pike and Sloan Title Services. In the alley, Valor pawed at a corner where the snow had been disturbed. Silas bent low, flashlight beam cutting across scraps of paper half frozen in ice, fragments of legal documents, torn jagged, some smeared with carbon ink. He pocketed them carefully, his mind already tracing connections he could not yet prove. He looked at Valor, who was sniffing hard at the teddy bear clutched earlier by Maisie. The dog's low growl hummed, not of threat but of recognition. "Good boy," Silas said, patting his shoulder. "We'll follow this trail, but not tonight." He straightened, gazing at the dark windows of Pike and Sloan. The sign above the door swung in the wind, creaking like a hinge to a locked truth. Back at the station, Marjorie tucked a blanket around the sleeping twins, her expression softened with a sadness she knew too well. Nora closed the file folder with a snap. "For now, Rowan, they'll stay with you. Safer than sending them to a temporary home while we investigate." Silas met her eyes and gave a single, steady nod. Valor circled the cot once, then lay down near the girls, his body curved like a shield. Silas rested a hand on his back, the old oath of loyalty renewed without words. Morning broke, gray and brittle over Elder Ridge, the kind of light that seemed reluctant to warm anything it touched. Silas Rowan had not slept, not with the fragments of carbon-smudged documents still burning in his pocket. The girls slept curled together under Valor's watchful eyes, their small breaths steadying in rhythm with his. When Sheriff Nora Beck stepped into the station, coffee steaming in her thermos, Silas was already waiting by the door. He had that soldier's stillness, ready to move when ordered, but tonight no one needed to give him the word. "We can't ignore what Valor found," he said simply. Nora studied him, then nodded. She called for Marjorie Hale, who arrived with her scarf drawn tight against the cold. Together they followed Valor back into the waking town. Valor led them with a certainty that turned every corner into a destination. His black and tan frame cut confidently through the snow, nose low, ears pricked, a living compass of loyalty. He stopped outside an old warehouse near the edge of town. The building sagged with neglect tin roof patched with rust, boards warped by years of weather, a no trespassing sign leaning by a single nail. Nora frowned. "This place hasn't been on record for years. I checked zoning when I took office. It was sold, but no one ever filed maintenance reports." Her voice carried suspicion heavy with experience. She had seen abandoned places like this before. They rarely stayed empty for long. Inside, the air was sour with mildew and dust. Shafts of weak daylight filtered through broken windows, catching dust motes that swirled like faint ghosts. The floor creaked underfoot. Valor prowled ahead, weaving between toppled crates, until his bark echoed against corrugated walls. Silas followed the sound and found what should never have been hidden stacks of filing cabinets, plastic bins, and boxes sealed with tape, each marked with numbers and initials. Nora tugged one open. Inside were deeds, wills, transfers, all stamped with notary seals that looked almost right. But Marjorie's sharp eyes caught the flaws, the ink blurred, signatures inconsistent, dates too perfect in their alignment. The name repeated across the pages was Vernon Pike. He had been a lawyer in Elder Ridge for nearly 15 years, a man in his late 40s with a reputation that split opinion. Some called him reliable, the kind of man who could make paperwork disappear in red tape for the right fee. Others whispered about backroom deals and mysterious inheritances that slipped quietly into different hands. Pike had the look of someone who wanted to be mistaken for respectable broad shoulders still pressed into sharp suits, thinning blonde hair combed precisely, and a smile that rarely touched his calculating blue eyes. He had grown up the son of a small-town preacher, but left faith behind when he learned words in legal language carried more weight than words from a pulpit. A failed marriage in Portland had sent him retreating back to small counties where oversight was weaker. Elder Ridge was perfect ground for a man who thrived in shadows. Marjorie carefully pulled one file free. "This isn't just fraud," she murmured. "It's systematic. They've been altering ownership for widows, orphans, anyone who wouldn't know the difference." Nora's jaw tightened. And if Ruth Drayton was one of them, it means Caleb and Opal didn't just neglect those girls. They helped steal from them. The truth weighed heavy in the quiet warehouse, the dust swirling as though disturbed by guilt itself. Across town, another door opened quietly. Bajon Whitaker, sleepless since the night she watched the twins abandoned, finally carried a small envelope to the station. Her cardigan was buttoned wrong in her haste, and her breath came in shallow bursts of nerves. Inside the envelope lay a Polaroid, grainy, edges curled, but unmistakable. It showed Caleb Drayton standing with Vernon Pike in the alley behind the diner, a ledger visible under Pike's arm. Jean's hands shook as she gave it to the deputy on duty. "I should have spoken sooner," she whispered, eyes shining with both shame and relief. "But I can't stay quiet anymore." For Jean, the memory of silence costing her a sister years ago returned sharp. This time she chose differently. Back in the warehouse, Valor pawed at a stack of folders near the ground. Silas knelt and tugged free a damp, mold-stained envelope. Inside was a property deed. Across the top, the name Ruth Drayton was written in fading ink, her signature shakier but clear. A second name, scrawled over hers, read Caleb Drayton, written in different pen, the edges of the letters jagged as though forced. Marjorie pressed her lips into a line. This was her bookstore. She told the girls it would be theirs one day. Valor growled low, his amber eyes flashing in the thin light. Silas gripped the paper tighter. The proof was no longer whispers in the dark. It was solid, ink-stained theft. They gathered the evidence carefully into bags. Nora snapped photos, her expression carved in stone. "This is bigger than we thought," she said. "Pike didn't just cheat one family. He's been building a network. And if Caleb's name is here, he wasn't just complicit, he was a willing hand." Outside, the wind pushed against the warehouse walls as though trying to warn them of how deep this corruption reached. Silas looked down at Valor, who was still sniffing the edges of boxes, and thought of the girls asleep back at the station, their futures hanging in the balance. "We'll bring it to light," he muttered, "no matter how dark they've buried it." The courthouse in Helena stood tall and austere against the winter sky, its marble columns streaked with decades of storms. Inside, the great chamber was hushed but heavy, filled with the murmurs of townsfolk who had driven in from Elder Ridge and neighboring communities, drawn not just by curiosity, but by the sense that the truth of their town was about to be tested. The wooden benches creaked beneath wool coats and tense bodies, while sunlight filtered through tall windows, spilling pale light across polished floors. At the center of the courtroom sat Judge Rosalind Keene, a woman in her early 60s with an angular face lined by years of unflinching decisions. Her gray hair was pinned tightly at the nape of her neck, her black robe draped over shoulders that carried both authority and weariness. Born to a mining family in Butte, she had known hard living in her youth, and the loss of her younger brother in a workplace accident had shaped her resolve to uphold law without bending. She was respected, sometimes feared, and always obeyed. Before the session began, the twins had been quietly cared for in a side chamber by a court volunteer, Mrs. Hattie Cole, a retired nurse in her late 60s with gentle hands and a quilted shawl. She had washed the girls' faces, combed their tangled blonde hair, and dressed them in warm outfits, a pair of thick wool sweaters, dark leggings, and sturdy boots that replaced the thin rags they had worn in Elder Ridge. Maisie whispered that the sweater smelled of lavender soap. Mabel pressed her cheek against the soft wool and smiled faintly for the first time in days. Hattie buttoned their coats tenderly, murmuring, "You deserve better than this cold." When they stepped into the courtroom, the contrast was striking. Two small figures who bore the marks of hardship, but now steadied by care and warmth. Maisie clutched the teddy bear button tightly, while Mabel pressed her hand against Valor's thick coat. The German shepherd lay at their feet, amber eyes steady, his head resting across the girls' legs as though to anchor them. Every time a tremor ran through their bodies, Valor shifted closer, silent reassurance embodied in fur and muscle. Silas Rowan sat behind them, back straight, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. His eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail: the defense table where Caleb Drayton slumped in a poorly fitted suit, his face pale and drawn from nights of drinking, and beside him Opal, whose golden curls were pinned in deliberate waves and whose emerald dress clung like armor. Her lips curved into faint smirks, but her hazel eyes betrayed panic darting beneath the surface. Their attorney, Philip Grayson, a wiry man in his late 50s with slicked back gray hair and rimmed spectacles, leaned close to whisper strategy. Grayson was known for theatrics, for twisting words until truth bent thin. His reputation was that of a man who fought hard but never clean. At the prosecution's side, Sheriff Nora Beck sat with files stacked in front of her, every page meticulously documented. She was not one for showmanship, but the steadiness of her presence spoke volumes. Beside her, Marjorie Hale adjusted her notes, her auburn hair tied back, her eyes soft but resolute. Both women carried themselves as though the weight of two children's futures sat squarely on their shoulders. The bailiff called order, and the trial began. Judge Keene's voice rang clear. "We are here to hear the matter concerning Maisie and Mabel Drayton, their welfare, and allegations of fraudulent property transfers tied to the late Ruth Drayton's estate." Silence fell. Grayson rose first, his tone slick. "Your Honor, what we have here are claims of children, malleable, grieving, and easily influenced by outsiders. Their memories cannot be trusted. My clients, Caleb and Opal Drayton, are simply victims of suspicion." But when Maisie and Mabel were called to the stand, the tide shifted. They walked with small, hesitant steps, Valor padding close until Judge Keene permitted him to remain. Maisie's voice trembled as she recounted the night. The door slamming, the suitcase spilling, her father's eyes glazed with liquor. Mabel added halting words about her mother's hospital stay, about papers thrust at Ruth while she cried, too weak to fight. The courtroom held its breath, and Valor pressed against their legs at each pause, grounding them with his calm presence. Nora took the stand next, presenting photographs of the warehouse, copies of torn deeds and notary seals clearly forged. Each item she explained in clipped, certain tones. Marjorie followed, her testimony weaving in the children's words, explaining how their memories aligned with the evidence. Then came Silas, who described the night he found the girls, his deep voice steady but edged with quiet anger. His description of their shivering forms in the snow painted an image no defense could undo. Finally, the room turned when Jean Whitaker rose from the benches. Her hands shook as she held a small Polaroid, her voice cracking but gaining strength. "I saw them," she confessed. "I saw Opal carrying documents late at night. I saw Caleb with Pike behind the diner. And I stayed quiet because I was afraid." She paused, her silver hair trembling as she lifted her head. "But silence is guilt too." "I won't stay quiet anymore," the crowd murmured, shock rippling through the benches. Caleb's head sank into his hands, shame pulling his shoulders low. Opal's composure shattered. She rose half from her seat, voice high and cracking. "Lies! All lies. She hated me from the start." Judge Keene's gavel slammed, silencing the chaos, but the damage was done. The mask had slipped, and everyone in the chamber had seen the raw fury beneath Opal's charm. As the evidence piled and the testimonies cut deeper, Judge Keene leaned forward, her gaze like steel. "This court will weigh all presented," she said, her tone final. "But what is already clear is that truth does not break in the face of theatrics." Her words carried through the room, landing heavy on Caleb and Opal, while Valor's steady breathing seemed to echo the certainty that justice was drawing near. The gavel struck once more, the sound echoing through the courthouse chamber like a stone dropped into still water. Judge Rosalind Keene's voice followed with calm finality. "Caleb Drayton and Opal Drayton are hereby stripped of guardianship over Maisie and Mabel Drayton. An investigation into forgery and fraud will proceed without delay. Until a permanent placement is determined, custody of the children will rest with Silas Rowan under oversight from the Child Protection Agency." The air shifted, What had been tense and brittle moments before now softened into a collective release. Caleb slumped further, a hollow man consumed by choices he could no longer excuse. Opal stiffened, her emerald dress a fading shield, eyes darting as if still searching for an escape route that no longer existed. Maisie and Mabel sat very still, wide-eyed and silent, as though the words had not yet landed in their small hearts. It wasn't until Silas reached forward, resting a steady hand on the bench beside them, that the realization began to settle. Valor nudged their knees, then pressed his great head into their laps, amber eyes lifting as though to tell them, "It's over now. You're not alone." For the first time, Maisie smiled, a trembling curve of lips that looked almost uncertain. Mabel followed, her small fingers tangling in Valor's fur. The courthouse, for all its stone and severity, had never held such quiet hope. Outside, the winter light was softer, gold edging the clouds as though dawn had been delayed just for this verdict. Silas guided the girls down the marble steps, their boots crunching against snow. Vendors and reporters had gathered at the street, but they stepped aside at the sight of the soldier with his coat spread over the shoulders of two children. He steered them past the crowd toward a small cafe tucked against the corner, one that still kept its doors open despite the cold. Inside, warmth blossomed, steam rising from mugs, the smell of cinnamon and coffee, chatter that was kind rather than curious. Silas ordered 2 hot cocos. When the drinks came, Maisie stared at the swirl of cream, hesitant, while Mabel lifted the cup to her lips, eyes closing at the first taste of sweetness. Silas watched, his own throat tight, knowing that this was only cocoa, yet it carried the weight of safety finally returned. Valor lay across their feet beneath the table, tail thumping softly whenever the girls giggled. News of the trial rippled quickly back to Elder Ridge. In the days that followed, the town seemed changed. Jean Whitaker, who had once hidden behind curtains, now stood in front of the old Little Lantern bookshop, the door locked since Ruth Drayton's death. With trembling hands but clear eyes, she spoke to neighbors and volunteers. "This shop was meant for Ruth's daughters. Let us bring it back, not just for them, but for every child who deserves light in this town." Jean was no longer the woman who let silence consume her. She had found her voice, and with it, redemption. People pledged books, paint, hours of labor. The old shop's windows began to shine again. Sheriff Nora Beck, energized by the exposure of Pike's scheme, set about forming a dedicated fraud task force. She called in deputies from surrounding counties, her voice ringing with conviction during the first meeting. "No family in Elder Ridge will lose what's theirs to deceit again. We will not look away." Her authority was no longer just in her badge, but in the trust people began to place in her. She carried herself taller now, her limp from that long-ago horse accident barely noticeable, because purpose had a way of straightening spines. For Silas, life bent into a new rhythm. He moved the girls into his uncle's farmhouse on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where pine logs creaked at night and the wood stove glowed steady. He gave them the upstairs bedroom with 2 small beds, quilts folded at the foot, and walls where drawings could be taped without worry. Maisie and Mabel were quiet at first, waking often in the night, but Valor slept across the threshold, a living barrier against old fears. Slowly their laughter began to return, thin at first like morning light, then fuller, bouncing off the rafters. It was Marjorie Hale who suggested one of the most healing gestures. "Silas," she said, her eyes kind but firm, "let the girls share their story with others. Not through testimony this time, but through community." Inspired, Silas worked with John and Nora to create a weekly library program, Reading with Valor. Every Saturday, children from town gathered at the reopened bookshop. Maisie and Mabel sat proudly with Valor curled beside them, his head resting on their laps while they turned pages. Other children read aloud too, their voices mixing with the warm scratch of pencils on paper as Marjorie handed out sketchbooks. The program became a symbol that courage and learning could grow strongest where kindness was planted. The twins, once cast out into the snow, now belonged to something larger than safety. They belonged to a town that had been shaken awake, to neighbors who refused to close their doors again. One evening as Silas tucked them in, Mabel whispered, "Is this home now?" He knelt by her bed, rough hands smoothing the quilt. "Home," he said quietly, "is wherever you're wanted. And you are wanted here, Maisie," already drifting to sleep, clutched button to her chest and murmured, "Don't let the door close." Silas smiled faintly, Valor lifting his head as though echoing the promise. "Not anymore," Silas said. "Not ever again." Sometimes the greatest miracles are not written in the sky, but lived in quiet moments on earth. A soldier who opened his home, a faithful dog who gave comfort without words, two little girls who learned that love can be stronger than loss. This is how light returns after the darkest winter. If this story touched you, share in the comments where you are watching from and what hope means to you today. Remember to like this video, follow and subscribe to the channel so you will not miss more stories of faith, love, and second chances.